Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jeff Shazinski, and I'm a project manager and agricultural economist at the National Center for Appropriate Technology, more commonly known as NCAT. I will be assisting in broadcasting this webinar, Organic Crop Rotations, Conservation Benefits. NCAT is one of 11 organizations who have joined with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, in the 3-year National Conservation Innovation Project that is working to better integrate sustainable and organic agriculture production systems into NRCS programs and procedures. Part of this project is to provide critical information and training like this to NRCS staff, farmers, and others who may provide technical service to organic and sustainable farmers. We are grateful to NRCS for its funding and support of this webinar and project. The 11 organizations who are joining with NRCS and NCAT in this effort are the Center for Rural Affairs, the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, the Midwest Organic and Sustainable Education Service, Organic Farming Research Foundation, Virginia Association for Biological Farming, Florida Organic Growers, Kansas Rural Center, Wild Farm Alliance, Land Stewardship Project, and Practical Farmers of Iowa. In addition to this project, one of the sustainable agriculture programs that NCAT manages, the National Sustainable Agriculture Information Service, which is better known as ATRA, provides publications, technical assistance through our telephone hotline and website, webinars, and other information to farmers, ranchers, and educators, extension agents, and those involved in sustainable agriculture across the country. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCAT's ATRA web page, as well as through a link on the NRCS website and other project member websites. Our presenters today are Mark Schoenbuck of the Virginia Association for Biological Farming and Harriet Bihar of the Midwest Organic and Sustainable Education Service. They will be discussing crop rotation strategies that many types and scales of organic farms can use to meet conservation objectives, market needs, and USDA organic requirements. Specific strategies used by organic farms in different parts of the United States will be given. As you're listening to today's webinar, you can type in any question you might have in the field you see on your screen. I'll gather them up, sort them out, and have Harriet and Mark answer as many as we have time for at the end of this presentation. Please don't be shy about asking questions. We won't be able to get to all of them during the webinar, but we will get back to you via email in the days to come. Also, before we begin, I just want to remind our viewers to take a few minutes to complete the survey you'll see on your screen immediately after we close here. In fact, we always welcome your questions to ATRA. You're welcome to call our toll-free technical assistance line, 1-800-346-9140. We also invite you to go to our website, www.atra.ncat.org, and click on Ask an Ag Expert button to send us a question by email. Don't worry if you don't get that phone number or website. They'll be on your screen at the end of the webinar. We respond to all questions we receive, and this service is offered free of charge. Our presenters, Harriet Bihar and Mark Schoenbuck, have extensive experience in organic agriculture production. Harriet is an organic specialist with Moses, the Midwest Organic and Sustainable Education Service, staffing their toll-free organic information line, writing organic fact sheets and articles, leading workshops and field days, as well as writing NRCS conservation activity plans for those transitioning to organic agriculture. She has over 20 years of experience as an organic inspector with knowledge of organic agronomic and horticultural crops, livestock, and food processing. She and her husband run a certified organic vegetable and small grain operation in southwest Wisconsin. Mark has done sustainable agriculture research, consulting, and technical writing for the past 25 years. His areas of experience include organic vegetable production, soil and nutrient management, soil test interpretation for organic systems, cover crops, mulches, sustainable weed management, and soil and resource conservation. He edits the Virginia Biological Farmer, the quarterly 12-page newsletter of the Virginia Association for Biological Farming, and helps maintain a homestead garden for a small community of 15 people. He serves on the board of directors of the Southern Sustainable Agriculture Working Group and does volunteer work in policy education and advocacy for family farms and sustainable agriculture. So it's time to get started. So let me turn things over to Harriet Mark.
Okay, next slide. Next slide. There it is. Welcome, everyone. I just wanted to mention, I think most of you know that the USDA has a law managing the word organic in the marketplace. And part of that is that if you sell more than $5,000 a year, you have to be certified. And under that organic certification regulation, there's a mandate that there is a soil building rotation where soil fertility and soil structure and increased organic matter are really the foundation of an organic farmer's production system on their farm. And of course, the NRCS believes in that as well, and many transitioning to organic farmers as well as existing organic farmers will use that conservation crop rotation practice standard 328 to help them accomplish their goals of soil improvement. Next slide. So this is actually the organic regulation. The words in red are what's important here. This is the definition of crop rotation under the National Organic Program regulations. And that is that the same species or family are not grown repeatedly in the same field without interruption. So this is very important. So a corn on corn rotation, even a corn beans rotation would not be acceptable in an organic system, and the farmer would not be certified after a few years if they don't include some sort of sod, crop, or legume in their rotation for soil building. Next slide. It also says that producers must select and implement tillage and cultivation practices that maintain or improve the physical, chemical, and biological condition of the soil and minimize soil erosion. So where needed, farmers may hear from the organic certifier that they need to put in contour strips or that they need to be putting in waterways, because an organic farm should be the gold standard of protecting the soil and the water in their region. Next slide. There's other reasons, too, for crop rotations besides improving soil fertility and tilth, but it also breaks pest and disease cycles and things like that. But the other thing, too, is that even in the application of manures, animal manures, those need to be put on the soil at a time and in such a way as to prevent pollution to crops or soil by those plant nutrients. Next slide. So like I was saying too, pests, weeds, diseases are all broken when there is a diverse crop rotation, which is something that organic producers are doing on all their farms and is being actually overseen by the organic inspectors and the organic certification agencies during their annual visits. Next slide. So organic producers actually view organic production very holistically. They see that when they are adding this organic matter to their soil through the use of green manures, cover cropping, compost. I think you went backwards, actually. Good. So this is actually the definition of organic production in the law. And if you notice, it doesn't really say what organic producers don't use, that they're not using synthetic fertility inputs or pest control materials. It's much more of a holistic way of looking at their production system. So it's site-specific, and it integrates cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster the cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. And so that's a very big picture, and it really is the vision of organic agriculture. Next slide. So under organic, you're going to find that the producers are much more interested in management than inputs because they have really a very limited scope of inputs that they can use for fertility, weed, and disease management. So therefore, they rely on cover cropping and crop rotations to control their pests and disease problems, to break those weed cycles, and of course to build soil organic matter, which gives them better soil tilth and makes their cultivation more effective and all kinds of wonderful things. Next slide. This is an old saying amongst organic farmers that feed the soil, not the plant. So they're always looking at improving the soil biological life, which Mark will talk about extensively when he gets on. Next slide. This is a slide from the Rodale Institute, the people who have been producing the Organic Gardening magazine, and they had New Farm magazine for many years, comparing the soil color and tilt between 20 years of similar tillage intensity with just crop residues returned to the soil and with an active system of adding cover crops and animal manures in the same time. And they have side-by-side conventional and organic trials going on that have been over 20 years. And so we have quite a bit of scientific evidence, and of course many of you soil agronomists know that when you do continually work at adding organic matter to the soil, you are going to get that deeper color, better smell, and better soil tilt. The other thing that organic farmers also really understand is that if they can have those living roots, that the incorporation of organic matter is not just basically brown organic matter, but living vegetation with living roots, because those really do attract the soil biology and enhance that. Next slide. Just as a little reminder, if you are working with organic producers, they do need to use organic seeds, and that includes any cover crop seed or green manure seed. If it's available as organic, they must use it. And high price is not an acceptable reason to not buy organic seed. And most synthetic seed treatments are not allowed, and GMO nitrogen-fixing bacteria is also not allowed. And there are GMO rhizobial bacteria out there, so that's something that the organic producer has to be watching out for, because if they use any prohibited synthetics, including that GMO bacteria, they will then be back to their 3-year transition to organic. Next slide. Also in the regulation is an actual hierarchy in what the organic producer must do in order to control diseases, weeds, and pests in their fields. So the first thing they should be looking at are cultural activities like crop rotation, sanitation, mechanical or physical exclusion, planting of beneficial insect habitat, repellents, mulching, flaming, that sort of thing. Second, they're allowed to move to biological or botanical or mineral inputs if the first has not been effective. And lastly, there are a list of approved synthetics on a national list for organic producers. But if they're going to use any of those synthetics, they have to prove that the first 2 were ineffective with some sort of observation log or soil fertility or whatever their or pest problems. They have to be documenting that they tried the first 2, basically a systems-based approach or something using natural inputs before they can move to synthetics. So for those farmers transitioning to organic, it is kind of a big change. We're not just substituting an approved organic input from the conventional input. You really are approaching pest, weed, and disease control as well as fertility management from a holistic system. Next slide. So organic farmers really work at that soil biology, balancing macro and micronutrients in the soil. You'll see them really wanting to get full soil tests, not just NPK, And they're really paying attention to the various types of green manures, ones that are deeply rooted versus shallow rooted, ones that are nitrogen fixing, ones that have allelopathic traits, and of course, those that would have more biomass incorporation. Next slide. And I know that there's a lot of concern with the NRCS about the negative impacts of tillage in organic crop rotation. But when the organic producer is adding these cover crops and incorporating a lot of biomass with living roots, they really are mitigating these negative impacts. Of course, you know, there will be tillage to incorporate these, but they are adding so much organic matter and improving the soil tilth dramatically that this really does help. The other thing is that since the organic farmer cannot have continuous row crops, there are always numerous years in the rotation when there is no tillage at all, when they're growing small grains or legumes, and that's even in a horticultural system. There should be at least some time. It may not be the entire season, but there could be a breakup in the middle of the season or at the end of the season where they are basically putting in a sod crop and letting that soil rest. And of course, there is the carbon sequestration going on at that time. So they're doing a lot of beneficial activities on an organic farm. And typically here in the upper Midwest, an organic farmer might rotary hoe maybe twice and do that fairly shallow, and then come behind that with 2 times, sometimes only 1, where they're actually doing row crop cultivation. Next slide. And Mark, that's up to you.
Okay. So what does soil life do for us? In nature, soil life is the entire source of soil fertility and nutrition for whatever native vegetation is present, the forest, the prairie. The soil life breaks down all of the plant residues, the leaves that fall each year, the annual plants that die, the dung from the animals, and any dead animals and insects. And they basically recycle the nutrients into a plant available form. And they don't do this in the same way that an application of conventional fertilizer, of pouring a large amount of soluble nutrients on at once. Instead, there is a gradual release over the course of the season, and it's often fairly well in tune with crop needs. And so, in effect, you have a much more efficient nutrient cycling when the crop rotation is designed to simulate as much as practical the natural condition of the crops and other life residues regenerating soil fertility. And another thing that happens when you have active soil life, if the soil life is well fed, if you're returning a sufficient quantity and diversity of plant residues to the system and also animal manures, you get a greater diversity and greater quantity of soil life. And the more biological activity in the soil, the less likely you are to lose nutrients through leaching. And in particular, a water quality concern is nitrogen leaching in farming systems. In addition to soluble fertilizers, frequent tillage and intensive cropping, especially when there are bare soil periods while you're waiting for the emerging crop to get established, those are vulnerable times for the leaching. However, the more activity you have in the soil, the less risk of leaching leaching will occur. In addition, the soil life improves the tilth or structure of the soil so that crusting is less severe, the soil surface is more open, more moisture can run into the soil during a rain event, less runoff, and as a result, there's more availability of water to the crops. And another outcome of a biologically active soil is it is less prone to erosion. Now, if you plow such a soil on a slope and there was a heavy rain, yes, it will erode. However, over the course of a well-managed rotation, the erosion can be reduced to a minimum by active soil life. Another thing that soil life does is the more diversity and abundance and balance you have in the soil food web, the less likely will a soil-borne pathogen, less likely is it that a soil-borne pathogen will reach population levels that cause a serious amount of crop disease. Next slide. Okay, there's three things. There's two are spelled out specifically, but basically there are three strategies that organic growers can use to manage for optimum soil biology. One is to reduce tillage when practical. Now, in an organic system where herbicides are not used because they're not the synthetic herbicides are not permitted by the organic standards, and none of the naturally based herbicides are really practical at a field level. Organic growers do depend to some extent on tillage. However, the rule is to the approach for sustainable organic production is to till only when necessary and to reduce the amount of disturbance of the rotation. When this is done, there'll be more fungi in the soil, get more of a balance between fungi and bacteria, and this really is favorable to most crops, and in particular the larger organisms that can be physically damaged by the frequent tillage. The earthworms and the small insects and mites will increase as well. The second main approach is through the crop rotation itself, the plant diversity, and designing the rotation to maintain living roots and living vegetation for as long of the season as possible. And the third aspect of it that's related to it is in designing that rotation, you try to maximize soil coverage and minimize the periods of bare soil. Perfect example here in the photograph, this farmer planted sweet corn and then interplanted, when the corn was established, interplanted those forage soybeans, so that after the sweet corn was harvested, the only thing being removed were the immature ears. You now have a tremendous biomass that's ready to go back to the soil when the frost finally knocks out the soybeans. Next. Next slide, please. Thank you. Thanks to some recent research and development of appropriate tools, organic farmers can now use no-till methods for at least part of their rotation, although it's not likely that an entire 3-year rotation that every operation can be done no-till because of perennial weed pressure. It is very often practical when a heavy cover crop has been grown to maturity, such as in this photograph on the right. That's Dr. Ron Morse at Virginia Tech holding a strand of rye and veg at full height. It was about 6 feet tall. There's about 3 or 4 tons of biomass per acre in that field. They're using a flail mower with the power takeoff turned off so that it acts as a roller crimper, and it's knocking down that cover crop. And in recent years, roller crimpers have been developed specifically for no-till management of cover crops without the use of herbicides. Upper left-hand picture. And then a no-till planter can be used in that very uniformly oriented and roll-crimped cover crop residue to establish the next production crop. Next slide. Here's an example with horticultural production in a rolled wheat cover crop on the left. It was rolled a couple of weeks earlier, so it's died out. It's turned brown. They are now using this no-till transplanter to create a slit through the part the mulch, create a narrow slot in the soil, and set the pepper plants all in one pass. And on the right, for a much lesser capital investment, a farmer can buy or build a no-till planting aid, which is simply a coulter and shank to create the slot in which either a conventional planter or manual planting methods can be used to establish the crop. This is very effective for transplanted and large-seeded vegetable crops such as potato and garlic, and even beans, squash, and sweet corn. Next. And there are several practice standards that the NRCS offers that relate to this. Listed here, the conservation crop rotation that was mentioned earlier. Cover crops, I just wanted to emphasize cover crops are an especially important part of crop rotation in organic systems so many different services. They replenish the soil, the legumes fix nitrogen, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. And they also play important roles in weed and pest management. And of course, the presence of a living cover crop protects against erosion. On a sloping field, another EQIP practice that's not listed here is Code 585 strip cropping. It's basically a conservation crop rotation arranged in relatively narrow strips where the different phases of the rotation alternate with each other. And this provides enhanced benefits in terms of bringing unlike plant families close together in close proximity. And this can slow down the spread of diseases and provide habitat for beneficial insects. Under the Conservation Stewardship Programs, a number of enhancements that build on these practices. The resource-conserving crop rotation takes conservation crop rotation to a higher level, maximizing the residue return and the soil protection. Continuous cover cropping is essentially a tight crop rotation or a no-bare fallow rotation. As soon as one production crop is finished, the next crop, either a production or a cover crop, is planted. And this particular practice must include at least one cover crop every year and no extended fallow. Intercropping, which I will show you an excellent example of relay intercropping in a few slides, that's basically planting two unlike crops in alternating rows or narrow swaths with each other, again, offering the potential for beneficial habitat, pest control, as well as maximum use of the soil. And whereas that sounds like, okay, we're drawing down the soil's nutritional resources, et cetera, and working it harder, it's also keeping it covered more completely. Next. Okay, a few principles and benefits and rotation. One is to vary the plant families year after year, so that on the left you see there's a broccoli crop in the alternate beds there, and so the next season we would not plant anything in those beds that are in the brassica or crucifer family. Like we would not go into a cover crop radish, nor into arugula or mustard salad greens. It would go into a different plant family, such as a cereal grain cover crop, a legume, or a tomato family. On the right hand, you see several strips of alternating different crop families. There's a buckwheat cover crop. It's hard to see from here, but it looks like there is some kind of an agronomic crop and then an actual sod. And what the alternating of plant families does is it primarily, the first thing it does is to break up weed, pest, and disease life cycles. Most pests and diseases attack specific plant families. Like a cabbage root maggot will attack broccoli, will attack arugula, but it won't do anything to buckwheat. So if you go into buckwheat and you go into a cereal grain after that broccoli, you will not have a buildup of that maggot. In addition, in a diverse rotation, you are often shifting the timing of planting and any tillage that is done and other field operations, so that the times of soil disturbance and the short periods of exposed soil or plants being established occur at different times of the year. And that helps break up weed life cycles, because weeds tend to, a particular weed species will come up at a certain time of year. In addition, this balances demands on soil nutrients and moisture. The broccoli is a moderately shallow-rooted, very heavy nitrogen-feeding crop. The buckwheat is shallow-rooted, but it's a very light feeder, and it tends to make phosphorus more available in the soil. You get into a legume like sweet clover, it's very deep-rooted. It'll be taking moisture from a much greater depth, and it will also be fixing nitrogen. Next. Another advantage of a very diversified rotation is if you can include flowering plants, particularly legumes, buckwheat, and anything with relatively shallow flowers with accessible nectar. These provide important habitat and food sources for both pollinators and for predatory insects and parasitoids that will control insect pests. Many of the parasitoids, the adult phase, is a very tiny wasp or fly that you will hardly notice. You'll think you see gnats flying around your cut flowers. A lot of those are the adult phases of beneficial insects that will then go into the vegetable crops nearby, They're very specific. They'll lay eggs on the pest, and that pest will be able to complete its life cycle and multiply. So one thing that horticultural growers often can do and often do is diversify from just vegetables into cut flowers. And a lot of those cut flowers, like zinnias and sunflowers, are excellent nectar and habitat. Also cover crops, letting cover crops come into flower, which is also recommended for getting maximum biomass and nitrogen fixation, and also they must flower to be able to be killed by roll crimping. And those flowering cover crops, many of them are also excellent nectar sources. Next. Another strategy that organic growers will use in designing their rotation is to delay the planting time for certain crops beyond the earliest possible planting. One variant on this practice is to prepare the seed bed at the normal time, but then wait a couple of weeks, just long enough for the weed seed bank to all germinate. Then, when they're very, very tiny, like you see in this picture, the grower will go through either with a flame weeder or the very, very shallow cultivation that does only a minimal amount of soil disturbance, and clean up those weeds and then immediately plant. This short, bare soil fallow, in addition to allowing the removal of many weeds, will also allow the soil to warm up some more. And this can be important in colder climates. Another thing that has been found is when the crop is planted at a time where soil temperature will favor its rapid emergence, is that the crop is vulnerable to weed pressure only for a short time. So that can reduce the frequency and intensity of cultivation required after planting. Next slide. Legumes, which fix nitrogen from the air and can provide up to 200 pounds, and very often at least 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen, is exceedingly important for organic production systems, because by not using soluble synthetic nitrogen, organic growers do face the challenge of how to get sufficient nitrogen to their crops, especially very heavy feeding crops like corn or broccoli or some of the other greens, the brassicas in particular. And what the legumes do is they fix this large quantity of nitrogen from the atmosphere. About half of it will become available to the succeeding crop, and the other half, however, is not lost. Instead, it becomes part of the soil organic matter. And soil biologically active high organic matter soils will all of their own release about 100 pounds or more of nitrogen per acre annually just through nitrogen mineralization. So the organic grower's job is not to supply the crop directly with all of its nitrogen needs, which might be between 1 and 200 pounds per acre, but to replenish the soil so that the process of mineralization does not draw the soil down over time. And so legumes play a vital role in this. Just some examples of legumes here: clovers, alfalfa, soybeans, which is a warm season cover crop, field peas, including Austrian winter field pea, cooler season. The Austrian winter will overwinter zone 6 and south. Chickling vetch is a summer annual vetch. Hairy vetch is a very hardy winter vetch. Bell beans and fava beans related to vetch, but they're frost killed at about 20 degrees. They're either a winter cover crop in the south or a spring cover crop in the north. Generally, when legumes are used and legume cover crop nitrogen is used, there's less risk of nitrogen leaching than with synthetic nitrogen or raw manure. Next slide. One thing that is being done more and more often is growing combinations of 2 or more species of cover crops to get multiple benefits. This photograph shows a winter grain clover mixture, which is very commonly grown to produce nitrogen. Actually, I see there are 3 species here. There's some vetch growing there as well. And in recent years, farmers and NRCS personnel have been experimenting with much higher levels of diversity of cover crops to widen the range of benefits, including crops, plants from several different plant families. This will increase the biomass, will diversify the benefits to the soil life. And that's one thing. The more different species of plants growing together or in the tight rotation, the wider the diversity of soil organisms will be supported. Okay, next slide. It's just a larger list of legumes. The challenge in a crop rotation, particularly a tight crop rotation where a farmer, a vegetable producer is growing produce on relatively limited acreage and with a very complex rotation, is how to fit the legumes into the production windows. So there are summer annual legumes, winter annual legumes, perennials for rotating a field out of intensive annual production into 1 to 3 years under a perennial sod. Combining these with the grass is a very good way to rest the soil. And then the biennial legumes are very, the sweet clovers have a very deep taproot, and they're very excellent for breaking hardpan biodrilling. In a situation where you have a lot of production brassicas in rotation and cannot use the tillage radish because of rotation plant family concerns, the sweet clovers are very useful. Okay, next. One thing that is very often done and is very beneficial is to grow the legume cover crop with a grass. This essentially provides a balanced diet for the soil life because soil organisms, like all life, require both carbon and nitrogen as well as other nutrients. And the carbon and nitrogen should be in a balance of about 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. If you were to grow a cover crop of just rye and then roll that down or till, or especially if it's tilled in, you will have such a high level of carbon that it will tie up nitrogen. If you were to grow just hairy veg, the nitrogen concentrations in that veg tissue when it's turned under is so high that some of that nitrogen could leach away before the following crop takes it up. However, if you have a rye plus veg cover crop, the nitrogen input is going to be balanced. In addition, if you look at a all rye field, look straight down from above, you will see that it is, you can see down to the soil surface unless it's an extremely heavy cover. And there will be some weeds growing down there. If you have just veg, it's just lying as a low mat, and it may actually kind of smother its own growth to some extent, and some weeds can break through. If you have the rye and veg together, the rye is supporting the veg, and you'll get a much more complete soil coverage. This is also true for summer combinations like sorghum Sudan grass and cowpea. So what happens is you have enhanced biomass and weed control. And another thing is that researchers have found that if you plant a legume by itself, it will actually not fix as much nitrogen as if that legume is growing with a grass. The reason is that when the legume is planted by itself, it will use available soil nitrogen until that is used up, and then it will begin to fix some nitrogen. However, if there is a grass like rye or sorghum Sudan grass that's rapidly taking up all available soluble soil nitrogen, the legume will be stimulated to fix at its maximum rate. So you actually get an increase in nitrogen gain as well as biomass. Next. So this has some examples of some other green manures that are not legumes. As I mentioned, the rye, oats, wheat, barley, and sorghum Sudan are good grasses to combine with legumes. There's also several species of millet that can be grown in the summer, either alone or with the cowpea or soybean. Buckwheat is very useful for a short fallow during the frost-free period. It will very rapidly form a canopy and choke out weeds, and it will actually reach maturity in 30 to 40 days. So that's very handy, like if you have a rotation of spring lettuce and then you're going into a late summer or fall planting of another vegetable, and you have a gap there of about 4 to 6 weeks. That's an excellent choice. Other non-legumes that are valuable are in the Cruciferal brassica family. These include the tillage radish that's shown here in the lower right. It's basically a daikon radish that's been selected for optimal cover crop properties. That deep root, that heavy taproot, goes down a foot or two below the surface, and then there's a fine taproot that can go several feet down. It's often called biological tillage or bio-drilling. That can really help to relieve hardpan and avoid the necessity of deep tillage with an implement. So next slide. Another option that cover crops offer is how to manage manure, especially on a farm where you have both livestock and crops, or if you have a nearby source of manure and that's the most affordable way to obtain nutrients. For example, if you have a soil that's testing very low in phosphorus, and it would be very beneficial to bring phosphorus on in the form of this abundant manure resource. As you can see from this photo, there are some hazards with spreading raw manure in the field when it's bare. Could very easily run off or leach into nearby water sources. And another concern under the organic standards and just for food safety in general is you want at least 120 days before an application and incorporation of a animal manure and harvest of the next organic food crop. Especially important for food safety around vegetables that are eaten raw or that are grown in or in close contact with the ground. So one thing you can do with a tight crop rotation that includes cover crops is to spread that manure on a cover crop. Or if your rotation includes forage crops, like you've been cultivating vegetables intensively for a couple of years and you rotate into a forage, you could apply the manure to that forage. And that could be a perennial grass or grass legume combination. And the living plants will take up the manure nutrients so that they do not pollute water resources. An excellent crop for this is sorghum Sudan grass. If you go out there when it's just starting its rapid growth and spread some manure or chicken litter, it's going to take up and hold all those nutrients and then return it in a much less leachable form. Next. One thing I should have mentioned in that last slide is that organic farmers do need to pay attention to their soil phosphorus levels, because if you depend too much on compost and manure as your source of NP and K, these materials tend to provide more phosphorus than the crops will need and not quite as much nitrogen. And as a result, phosphorus levels can build up. And once they reach the optimal level, the organic grower will want to cut back on the manure applications. This is true of all growers, and rely more heavily on the legume nitrogen fixation to ensure sufficient nitrogen. Okay, another strategy in designing rotations is alternating deep and shallow-rooted crops, and this applies to both cash crops and green manure crops. For instance, if you've been growing lettuce and spinach that have relatively shallow roots, if it's followed by tomato or squash, those production crops will actually send their roots 3 or 4 feet deep. And then you might want to follow that with a legume grass combination cover crop in the fall, which is also fairly deep. And so you have a complementary use of nutrients, and it will also, if you're using legumes that are deep-rooted, will replenish nutrients to the soil profile. Next. Okay, it's always a challenge, especially in horticultural crop rotations, to ensure that sufficient high biomass and high residue crops are included in the rotation. Of course, the cover crops help us out a lot there. However, remember also that there are several number of production crops that do as well. Cereal grains grown for grain production. There is increasing interest in organic and specialty grain crops, and the residues, of course, are returned to the soil. Sorghum Sudan, which can serve as a forage, as well as a cover crop. Very, very high biomass. Sweet corn similarly. Okay, next. One thing to keep in mind is that, again, the more diverse your cropping system, the more healthy and diverse the soil life. And you can look at it even just from the point of view of the physical architecture of the root system. A grass is a very fine, fibrous net that just permeates the entire topsoil. A legume like sweet clover or a brassica like radish will send a taproot down 3, 4, 5 feet. And various production crops will also have varying root architecture. In addition, every plant species gives off a distinct and characteristic spectrum of soil, plant exudates, root exudates. Like just as a radish will taste different from a tomato to us, the exudates from a brassica versus the exudates from a tomato family crop will look very different to the soil life. So different crops support different soil life, and by varying this, you will promote a greater diversity and balance in the soil life. Next. Okay, some examples of rotation systems for horticultural crops. As I mentioned earlier, horticultural growers, especially in warm climates, will tend to try to grow 2 or 3 vegetable crops like spring lettuce and late summer cucumbers, or a spring onion crop followed by a fall broccoli. So the challenge is to incorporate into that rotation sufficient high residue and green manure crops to keep the soil life well fed and to prevent erosion. Some examples are you can grow a short season green manure in the spring, like oats and field peas, and that can be incorporated in June in time for main crop tomatoes. It can even be, in some cases, rolled down. After a spring vegetable, a midsummer crop of soybeans and millet or cowpeas or buckwheat, and that can often be followed by a fall planting such as garlic, which is planted pretty close to the frost date and is harvested the following summer. Many vegetable growers routinely use high residue green manures over winter, typically for rye or triticale or wheat combined with one of the winter hardy legumes. And also, when the farmer has sufficient land to do this, it's really advisable, and it is often done, to rotate a field that has been worked hard for a few years into a full year of green manures, either a series of annual green manures grown in quick succession after one another, or simply rotating to a perennial sod. You can sow a little bit of oats and then a mixture of perennial grasses and red and white clovers, which are perennial clovers. And then the oats can be mowed off or even harvested for grain, and the clovers and grasses can be allowed to grow 1 to 3 years. When that sod is then finally broken, the soil has had a chance to rest. Very often annual weed populations have reduced considerably. A lot of carbon and nitrogen has been returned to the soil, and production often is, many farmers have told me how good production is after that perennial sod year. Next. Here's just 3 timelines, 3 alternative timelines for soil building and production crops. Some growers will actually have a rotation where they produce only in alternate years, and then the intervening year, again, is either the perennial or a series of annual soil building cover crops. Farmers with a smaller land base may choose to do a marketed crop every year. I would have to comment that on this diagram, if the rotation is on that schedule year after year, where the production crop is planted in the late spring, unless they are able to do no-till cover crop management, that can lead to a buildup of annual weeds after several years because the soil would be disturbed at the same time each year. Another strategy is to actually plant the soil building crop into the production crop when the production crop is established but is not yet mature. Then the soil building crop, typically a shade tolerant species like clover, will get established, and as soon as the marketed crop is harvested off or cleared or is killed by frost at the end of the season, the cover crop then takes over. Many growers will seek to vary, make the rotation a little more diverse by varying the planting date of that market crop. Next. Here's an example from central Vermont. That is a very cold climate, about zone 4. This is Elliot Coleman's farm. I took these photos about 30 years ago when he was farming in central Vermont at about 1,600 feet elevation. That's 8 vegetable crops and 7 green manures in an 8-year rotation. And very little bare soil. Again, that's that corn-soybean intercrop. He also has brassicas, which are just in the middle of harvest. These photos were all taken in October after the first light frost. You can see as he's clearing the brassicas, the clover is already established, and below that, where the tomatoes, where the tomato harvest ended a little earlier and the plants were cleared, the red clover in the alleys has almost completely covered the ground. Next. And here's an example from here in Floyd, Virginia, where I live. This field was in intensive vegetable production for a couple of years, 1 or 2 vegetable crops and 1 winter annual crop each year. And in the 3rd year, it was planted to a cereal grain underseeded with red clover. The cereal grain was harvested off and harvested as grain, and the red clover was allowed to grow for a full year. And so this is an example where you can get 2 years of intensive production and then 1 year in rest. And depending upon the soil quality and the needs of the soil and also the market needs of the farm, that perennial period could be extended to 2 or 3 years. Next. And this is just an example of how a vegetable farmer can implement a diversified crop rotation, not only in terms of plant family and crop architecture, but also in time. This is an aerial photo of a garden at Guilford College, a small farm, and you can see that some crops are near harvest and have completely closed canopy. Some crops are at mid-growth. Some have just been planted. And although we do see some bare soil there, you also see illustrated here the opportunity to vary the timing and the type of soil disturbance that each particular bed receives. Because next year, the position of all those crops will be moved, so that the ones that have been tilled and planted in midsummer, just before this was taken, would be planted early in the spring and would be under a heavy crop canopy in midsummer. This can aid with weed management, and this is very important because weed management is the Achilles heel of the organic producer, in that often repeated cultivation is required. You see a number of alternate tactics here to reduce the need of cultivation. That in-row drip irrigation on all those beds means that the farmer is feeding and watering the crop and not the weeds. There are organic liquid fertilizers that can be provided, such as fish emulsion, right through the drip. The mulching in those wide row crops, of course, that's keeping weeds down without cultivation. And the crops that have closed the canopy are providing their own weed control. So next slide.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the corn and beans. And even though these are crops that will go all season, those farmers also have a way of getting those cover crops in. For instance, in Iowa, I've seen quite a few producers come in very early in the spring if it's dry enough, and they'll put in a crop of oats, and then they'll have enough time to till that in before they plant their soybeans. The same thing, they might come in after soybeans and put in rye and vetch. So they'll try. And even once in a while, you'll see even some interseeding. Let's say into corn at the last cultivation, they might have a broadcast seeder on the front of the tractor, and at the same time they're cultivating and just kind of get that seed in. something fairly inexpensive like a red clover, or even throw in grasses and buckwheat just to get some cover on there, so there'll be something to till in just some more biomass. And of course, in a row crop rotation, they are going to be basically forced by the certifier, even if they don't want to do it, to put in some kind of small grain and legume in rotation. And they may choose, even if they don't have livestock, that they'll put in a clover and then just till it in. They might not even harvest it for hay, or they might have hay as part of their rotation. Next slide. The other thing, too, is that if anybody has ruminants on their farm that are certified organic, they are going to have to get a significant portion of their feed value from grazing. And so high-value pasture is very much a part of the crop rotation. The pasture on an organic ruminant farm, either beef or goats or dairy, is not shunted over to the kind of rocky side hills. It is very much right in there with the valuable, fertile, flat bottomland, because they need that pasture is a significant portion of the feed that they're giving to the animals, and so they include many times pasture in the rotation. So you might see, corn, beans, seeded to oats, and then underseeded with a pasture mix, and then it sits in pasture for 3 years, and then they go back to corn. You might see also that perhaps after a small grain is taken off, if it hasn't been underseeded, or even if it had been, they might till that in and plant turnips for fall livestock forage. You might see a lot of the livestock perhaps out there foraging, on the hay crop. Instead of taking a last cutting or taking a mid-season cutting, they'll rotate that as pasture, getting then the animal manure on those fields, on that living vegetation, and then rotating it back to a hay crop for the last crop or whatever. And again, as Mark said, if you are doing vegetables, and this is only for human-consumed crops, that there has to be a waiting period between the application of raw manures and the harvest of the crop. Next slide. Next slide. Somehow the slide doesn't like me. Hello?
There it is.
There we go. Whoops. No, too far. Back to the grazing. There we go. So, as I said, that pastures are a high-value crop because 30% of the nutrition during the grazing season has to come from pasture. A lot of times, too, you will see organic farmers, they underseed their small grains with some type of legume, whether or not they're going to harvest it as hay, because it also, again, typically will fix nitrogen. It'll give them a wonderful green manure to incorporate, and it also serves as a weed control because they don't have bare ground onto those small grains. They have it seeded down with clover or alfalfa. You'll also find organic farmers interseeding grasses into their alfalfa because they have that better carbon to nitrogen ratio when they till it in, and also it is less attractive to leafhoppers if there's some grass in with the alfalfa rather than just having a monoculture. And lastly, it's better for ruminant health to have a mix of forage instead of having 100% alfalfa hay. You've got those long stem grasses, which are much healthier for those ruminants. Next slide. So in perennial horticultural systems, there are many things that people can do. They can either plant annual or perennial crops in the alleyways that are mowed, and then actually the mower can then blow that cut crop into the area under the trees, and then they have a mulch. They can grow beneficial insect habitat. during the season with something like buckwheat or other perennial crops. And here in Wisconsin, I see a lot of asparagus growers, and these can be people, I've seen people doing it at even the 50 to 100 acre asparagus farms, where they plant winter rye after the frost, and then in the early spring, they will shallowly incorporate that. And that does a great job for then, keeping that perennial crop, improving that soil tilth, and it offers weed control as well. Next slide. So even in an agronomic system, you can have strip cropping, as the NRCS has a practice standard on that. And by breaking those monocultures, you're breaking those diseases, breaking those insect cycles. You'll see a lot of organic farmers wanting to put in field borders and conservation to have beneficial insect habitat. You'll also see them growing thin strips of beneficial insect habitat annuals, let's say, down the middle of their field, and then mowing them off when they start noticing insect pressure in their cash crops, driving those beneficials over into their cash crops when they're needed. So you basically kind of raise them and then kick them out of the house and say, go to work. Another thing, too, is strip cropping by having various heights of crops, like having soybean strip next to a corn strip, next to a alfalfa strip. You get more light along those edges and increase your yield. And those organic farmers who are doing vegetable crops and they have permanent raised beds, they have much less compaction in those beds because the wheels of the tractors are never driving over where they might grow a crop in the future. Next slide. Another thing you'll see is bioenergy crops. A lot of organic farmers and conventional farmers are interested in saving money, and they are very attracted to the fact that maybe they could change their diesel tractors over to something that can run on biodiesel, and they can actually produce their own fuel. So you'll see sunflowers, soybeans, canola, camelina grown in rotation on many farms for that biodiesel production. Another thing you see a lot on organic farms for vegetables, at least I have seen, is taking those smaller tractors, things like LSGs and those older farmalls, the A's and the C's, and actually making them electric tractors. And then I've been to farms that have wind power or solar, and then they plug in those tractors, and all that fuel for running their tractors is all coming from renewable resources. Next slide. So just to kind of wrap up, people are looking to it. This is something that organic farmers really think about, both agronomically, crops like corn and beans and small grains, as well as horticultural crops, to really rotate those deep and shallow-rooted crops, to think about rotating crops to offer benefits to the succeeding crops. So the brassica family has some fungicidal benefits. So if they're following with another crop that they've had some issues with fungal problems, especially root problems, they might say, well, I really need to, put brassicas in before those crops. And, of course, always looking to rotate the crops with different nutrient needs and benefits. And this is something that's been done for generations. There's always been that the alfalfa, at least here in the upper Midwest with dairy farms, they always follow the corn crop after they've plowed in their alfalfa. Next crop. Next slide. I'm already thinking about crops. So you're going to see a lot that in a 5-year rotation, you also see a lot of long rotations on organic farms, anywhere from 3 to 4 years to 7 and 8 years, where they're growing a whole variety of crops to break those monocultures, to break those weeds and pest cycles. You might actually see at times on an organic farm, especially a dairy, where they might grow 2 years of corn, in succession, which technically doesn't meet the organic regulation, but then they're putting in a small grain and leaving it in hay for another 4 to 5 years. And so when you're looking at that 7 to 8 year rotation, there's only 2 years of row crop, and it's much more of a soil building rotation, and so the organic certification agencies have found that to be acceptable. Another thing that I see people doing is perhaps putting in a rye crop. If, let's say, that first corn crop was corn silage, they would have enough time to come in, incorporate that residue, plant rye for the winter, and then the next spring till that in and plant corn again. And then they've had that mandated interruption between 2 years of the same crop in the same field. Next slide. In high tunnels, you'll see that, again, that they shouldn't be growing tomatoes and tomatoes and tomatoes. They're rotating various high-value crops. So they might even try to grow some lettuce, let's say, next to the young tomatoes, and by the time the tomatoes are shading out that lettuce and going into production, the lettuce has already been harvested. So in that high-value real estate under that high tunnel, they are really paying attention. And then the picture on the bottom is actually my high tunnel, and you can see I've got some melons and there's some young tomatoes that you can't quite see there. And then I've got most of it in buckwheat, because I grow mostly in that high tunnel through the winter spinach and lettuce here in Wisconsin. And last year I sold greens every week from October to May. And so for me, I wanted to make sure that soil in there was fertile, and that I was dealing with my weed problems. And actually I tilled in that buckwheat, and right now I have a mix of chickling vetch and oats growing in there, and I will be tilling that in a couple of weeks, and then planting my spinach and lettuce for my winter season. Next slide. So for both horticultural producers and agronomic producers, there typically can be a window, either in the beginning of the season, at the end of the season, or if someone's growing a small grain, even mid-season, to put in a short season cover crop. You'll also find that organic producers are using things like planting oats in the fall and letting it winter kill, and that can be done, on a farm that's growing corn, just to kind of protect that soil over the winter. But then they don't have a living crop they have to incorporate if they want to put in an early season crop, let's say like corn or spinach. They just basically have a kind of a mulch that died in place. And of course the oats, even planted this time of year, would not go to seed. You're just going to get that green vegetation. Another thing that I see agronomic producers do is they plant rye in with their drilled soybeans in the spring. And the rye actually then crowds out any other weeds that grow, and those would be mostly for producers who are growing livestock feed grade soybeans, because there will be some staining of the beans when they're combining them. But it does work quite well. And of course then you don't have a monoculture either. Okay, next slide. This is an excellent book put out by the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Fair. This is the website, and you could go there and download it PDF as a PDF, chapter by chapter, or you can purchase the whole book. And it's an excellent book which has a lot of different rotations for different types of farming systems, a lot of ideas for various cover crops and how to fit them into the rotations. And so I would recommend that to anyone who wants to learn more. Next slide. And here's my contact information, Mark and Atras.
Thank you, Harriet and Mark. Thank you very much. It's a lot of information, and we've had a lot of questions. I'm sure we won't be able to get to all of them the remaining time we have, but I'll start down the list and see how far we get. A caller has a small avocado orchard and has some extra room around on the outside of the orchard, and they're wondering whether cover crops, I guess they're kind of hinting at orchards and cover cropping, and I guess it's not exactly a rotation, but are they useful in such for orchards to have cover crops?
Well, yes, I've seen them. Well, mostly I'm not familiar that much with avocados. We don't grow them here in the upper Midwest, but we do have apples and raspberries. And like I said, you can do cover cropping in the alleyways. You can even do some cover cropping under the trees. And there is something called a weed badger, which is basically a mower that mounts on the side of a tractor that has kind of an arm that when it hits the tree, it kind of rolls around the tree and then continues. And it does a very shallow incorporation of whatever cover crop you might have planted there. So yes, cover cropping can be very useful. Also, I think that avocados are not as long-lived a tree. I might not be quite correct about that, but I think that they not like apples. And so thinking about having a couple of years of cover cropping before you plant to really increase that soil tilth and organic matter, so that when it does rain, you hold on to that moisture. You have better soil structure, so the roots go deeper. All those things can be done in a perennial system, right before you plant your orchard, and also even while the orchard is in existence.
Mark, did you have any comments? I heard you.
Yeah, in addition, this is a tremendous opportunity to grow beneficial habitat by selecting a diverse mixture of flowering plants. Legumes can be used and periodically mowed to provide some nitrogen for the trees. And it is vitally important to keep those aisles covered. I mean, there's nothing harder on the soil than just to have wide, bare soil stretches between your rows of avocado or apple trees or any other fruit. I think that's the one challenge is to make sure that the flowering of the ground cover does not compete with trees for pollinators, or that the ground cover itself does not compete, especially when the trees are still young. That just takes some careful management and timely mowing.
Thank you. Here's a very somewhat specific, but I think it gets to the issue of continuous row crop. Where in the NOP rule does it state continuous row crop is not allowed? Somebody seems to not agree with that, I guess.
Well, it's the definition of crop rotation, so that's the same crop, but there's also a mandate for soil building rotation, and that was discussed. Must manage crop nutrients to maintain or improve soil organic matter content. And unless you have some sort of cover cropping or sod crop in that rotation, you are not going to be maintaining or improving that soil organic matter content. Continuous row cropping with the need for the tillage to control the weeds is going to be destroying organic matter rather than improving it. Now to go back, perhaps if someone could figure out a way to do continuous organic no-till where they are rolling down a cover crop and are continually doing row crops in a rolled, not mechanically killed mulch, perhaps you could do that. But it's a little bit difficult to do a continuous no-till, mechanically killed mulch row crop system.
Mark, any comments?
I think that the comment is referring to, like, you wouldn't want to do continuous corn after corn, even with a winter rye and vetch cover crop. That would not be permitted. But if you had a row cropping system where your row crops were corn, then soy, then cotton, then you had a couple of winter cereal grains in there, and you had a couple of legume or legume grass cover crops, you could have a production system that's agronomic crops every year, so long as there's sufficient diversity and sufficient residue return. The organic standard says that the crop rotation to build and maintain soil quality would include but not be limited to legumes, green manure, sod crops, etc. So we didn't mean to say that you could not have a cropping system that was all agronomic, that all the production crops were agronomic crops, only that there needed to be sufficient diversity and sufficient soil-building crops included.
Right. And I mean, if someone could work out a system where they were intercropping, underseeding red clover in their corn, and then the next year they did beans and they had rye out there with the beans, then they could go back to corn again, because they will be improving the soil organic matter, because they're not doing quite as much tillage, and they actually have more than just crop residue to return to the soil every year. If you remember that one slide from Rodale, the difference between just returning crop residues in a row cropping system, whereas a cropping system which also included cover cropping and animal manures, the difference in the color and tilt of those two soils. And that's what we're trying to go for. So, I mean, I suppose someone could do a corn, bean, corn, bean, corn, bean rotation, but they would have to have, be doing some kind of experimental and interesting things with interseeding and getting in those cover crops, so they would be improving that soil organic matter.
Thanks. Here's do cover crops that provide habitat to beneficial insects also provide habitat to insect pests?
That is a very important question, and that's where the issue of plant families come in. A legume cover crop, if you're following it with English peas or snap beans, you could run the risk of a pest or disease being harbored. On the other hand, if you are varying the plant family, you're much less likely to run into this. Sometimes a cover crop will indeed harbor aphids or caterpillars, and that's not all bad, because the beneficials come because the plant-eating insects are there. You just want to make sure that if you're growing a small grain or a legume that is creating this ecosystem where it's got aphids and ladybugs and lacewings, that you don't then try to grow right next to it a production crop that is susceptible to the same aphid. Now, the biggest challenge comes up with pest nematodes. And for instance, pest nematodes will often, a given nematode species, such as root knot, will attack several plant families. So if you're in an area with root knot nematodes, growing crimson clover or red clover ahead of tomatoes is not a good idea. Now, if you're in an area where there isn't much root knot nematode, no problem. The tomato is going to thrive on the legume nitrogen, and there will probably be beneficials that the legume has encouraged either soil organisms or insects. Now, one thing to remember about pest nematodes is their abundance is often a symptom of poor soil quality and low diversity of the soil biota. So just by implementing a good crop rotation and ensuring adequate soil organic matter return, perhaps using some compost to provide an inoculum for beneficial organisms, will in general tend to reduce nematode problems. There are situations, however, even with those measures, that certain nematode pests will be a serious problem. This crop rotation manual that we discussed a few minutes ago is an excellent resource on determining whether there is a nematode carryover problem between a particular cover crop and its successive and the next production crop.
Thanks, Mark. This is from Central Florida, and it maybe also helps with another question that was more general about tropical or maybe semi-tropical. We did have a webinar on this earlier in this series, which I would also point folks to see on the ATRA website. But he said that the caller says, I live in Central Florida where we get loads of rain, bugs, and fungi during June through September. Do you recommend no growth during this period, or any other recommendations? And that's actually, some people are talking about having a kind of fallow period, I guess, as well as part of a rotation.
This is Mark again. I would say in a hot, humid climate like that, avoid bear fallow like the plague. But by all means, take a break. Don't be going out there trying to battle insects and harvest vegetables in 100-degree heat and humidity. Plant it to a very heat-loving cover crop like sorghum sudan or pearl millet, along with a vining cowpea, and just let that field make biomass. And the bugs are going to be suppressed, the weeds are going to be suppressed. You're going to be breaking up your fungal disease life cycles by not planting their favorite production crops. The rain is just going to make those crops give you tremendous biomass. And I'd say make sure you have a flail mower or other means to manage the biomass when you're ready to plant your fall crops. And you might even be able to no-till them.
Yeah, I agree. Any kind of black fallow, just bare dirt, especially if it's raining. I mean, you want to protect that soil with a living mat of vegetation. And I think what Mark suggested was a good idea. I don't know, there might even be other cover crops that grow real well in your region, but since I'm from Wisconsin, I don't know Florida that well.
I just want to add that there is an extension person in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Her name is Milagro Berhani, and the way she has dealt with the severe weed pressure is to grow a spring vegetable, rotate into a summer cover crop of cowpeas or cowpeas and sorghum, and then back into summer vegetables. I just found that that solved a lot of the weed problems in addition to restoring soil quality. So there's a lot of practical examples of this.
Mark will probably appreciate this question, and are there ways to objectively measure improvements in soil quality to ensure that these soil building practices through rotation and cover crops are actually working?
Oh, that is a tough question. I have found that measures of soil organic matter percentage, they're very approximate. You can get very variable figures that can be frustrating to see it jog up and down. There's a newer technique of measuring what's called active organic matter. That's the recently formed and broken down organic matter that turns over relatively rapidly, consists of the soil biota and an immediate byproduct, and is the source of the slow-release nutrients that I mentioned. If your soil is being well taken care of, it will tend to have more active organic matter. However, at this point, I would say that just the visual observation of things like the color and texture of the soil, like you saw in that side-by-side comparison in the slide of the Rodale experiment, the crop performance. The farmer really knows when a field is getting tired and really needs to be put down into a perennial cover or a very high biomass annual cover. And on the other hand, farmers can see very clearly, you'll see it in crop performance. You get a dry summer like a lot of people have had this year. If there's a field that you've been working on trying to build soil quality and you go, wow, that crop's doing amazingly well despite the drought, that's an indicator of soil quality. Another example is you get a heavy rain, you don't see any runoff. That's another very good sign.
Well, thank you. I think that's all the time we have, and I know there were more questions. Again, this webinar, there were some people that said they wanted to look at earlier slides. This webinar will be posted probably in the next few days, if not tomorrow, on the ATRA website at www.atra.ncat.org, so you can re-listen to the whole thing from start to finish and see any slide you need again. And again, we'll be back to you about any questions you had specific to the presenters or to more generally to ATRA. And again, if you have questions on other things, you can again call our ATRA hotline or ask an ag expert function of the ATRA website. I also finally want to remind you of one more additional webinar in this Conservation Innovation project, which will be coming up next month. It's entitled Links Between Biodiversity Requirements of Organic System and NRCS Practice Standards. And this will be presented by Joanne Baumgartner from the Wild Farm Alliance. It will be September 27th at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Again, once again, please take a few moments to complete the evaluation survey, which you will see on your screen immediately after we close this webinar. Again, thank you all for attending today's webinar, and have a good day.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
The organizer